Misha here, and I'm braving the late July heat to bring you another AK video, or rather RPK, the overgrown AK. And this has always been a personal favorite of mine ever since I learned about it 20 some odd years ago, but it's not the easiest thing to get a true 100% parts correct RPK in America, but I've had a lot of fun. I have my two examples out here in 7.62x39. If you like this video enough, we'll do a look at the 5.45 later versions. To represent the original RPK, and this is an early kit build from Legion USA. No DAC receiver, and yes, it is a US barrel, but it is chrome lined and to a correct spec. Everything else is matching Molot parts. And behind it, again, you've seen in many videos, and we'll probably continue to see, my Romanian imported Kuger AES-10B paratrooper, 1989 dated, so quite late production. And they're good examples of early and late production in general, plus a unique Romanian variant. And we'll also talk about the RPKS and a few other bits and bobs, history, why this was picked, some interesting little factoids, and we're going to shoot them, at least going with as much ammo as I've got left. I've got some Wolf, some Tele, maybe a little bit of that Grom, so we'll see. Alright, gonna have to do at least a good chunk of this inside because it is 95, 96 out, and the humidity, you could cut it with a, well, bullet, I suppose. But we will get some shooting done. Hello, I'm like Wilson behind the fence over here with an RPK. There we go. But as I said, this is kind of a follow-on to the last AK video where we talked about the move from the original AK-47, to the AKM, and it's very closely related. As far back as 1955, the powers that be, the Soviet Ministry of Defense, the government, they wanted to have a weapons system, basically a light machine gun and an infantry rifle that were pretty cross-compatible as much was practicable. The old RPD, it just wasn't working out. Actually, a couple months ago, did a video on an RPD, so check that out if you haven't. The pros and cons, but it does date back to 1944, so technically a World War II era gun. But the rifle is going to take precedence. So the AKM gets developed and officially adopted in 1959. But really, it had been selected by 57, 58, and they were going through pre-production, ironing out manufacturing, giving it to various troops across the Soviet Union, doing environmental tests, final little tweaks before they were putting it into mass scale. And it would be produced not only at Izhevsk, like the original AK, but the new Tula factory. Well, not new, but you know what I mean, AK production. Tula had been doing SKSs up till this point, kind of the safe choice. With that more or less done and dusted, it was time to begin developing this guy here. Legion RPK. That was with that Tele ammo. And I have to remind you, please do like, share, and subscribe. You can do that. Also, please comment. And if you'd like to help support the channel, there's always the Patreon page. Requirements are pretty much exactly what you'd expect. A, needs to fire 7.62x39. Needs to be air-cooled, man-portable. Also, it needs to be operable by one person, so no machine gun teams. You could have extra people carrying ammo, but no, one person. And this is really to go with evolving Soviet doctrine at the time. We'll get to that a little bit later in the video, but it does make sense. It needs to be, obviously, accurate in automatic fire, able to do sustained automatic fire. It needs to have a barrel that has an extended life, so no having to change barrels every 5 or even 10,000 rounds. And it needs to, of course, because it's the Soviet Union, be cheap, easy, efficient to mass produce. I mentioned it in many AK videos, but the trick about the AKM and the RPK by extension, they're not cheap to produce if you only need 20, 30,000, or even 50,000. No, it's economy of scale. The initial setup to produce these guns, they don't mind if that's expensive. They've got giant factories, labor's cheap, but they want to be able to produce these in large quantities. In the case of the AKM, millions. In the case of the upcoming light machine gun, hundreds of thousands at least. So once you get the initial cost investment set up to make these, individual guns are cheap, dollars as today we would think. So that's a big deal. Obviously, dependability, reliability, that kind of thing. Funnily enough, it wasn't required that it be based on the AK. But it did have to work within the logistical system of the AK, because the AK was started off as basically a quasi submachine gun. Early in the 40s, 50s, a lot of nations really didn't know where to put this. The concept of the assault rifle was still kind of making its way through military minds, especially the older folks. But once they knew they were, they made the AK Type 3, they got all the kinks worked out of the mill gun, they know they were going to the AKM, now this is going to be our standard thing. This is what we're going to go with. They've kind of zeroed in what they want to do with it. So it's important, and the new light machine gun has to work within the logistical system. Obviously, parts interoperability is great when and where possible. They did also specify it needed to have a bipod, presumably, fixed, but it had to be able to have one and fire stable from it. The idea basically with a gun like this is when you're in more of an offensive role, you'll fold it up. And when you are in a more defensive fixed position, you'll unfold it. And so there's basically two different firing modes. On the bipod, gonna try out this drum. This is how an RPK is meant to look. Good. Interestingly, one thing that was strictly specified, it could not feed from belts. Now the RPD had drums, but they were just hollow containers, kind of like an MG42. They had 50 round non-disintegrating link belts in them. No, they don't want this. There's pros and cons to belts, but they wanted magazines. Obviously, the AKM used by this time, 1956, 57, this pattern of mag, the stamped steel ribbed mag, lighter than the original slab. This is long before Bakelite came along. Lots of benefits to magazines. Of course, a few drawbacks too on the amount of rounds to be fired. But the RPD did not have a quick change barrel. The upcoming rifle most likely won't either. So when you have to work with the same barrel, honestly limiting rate of fire and number of rounds fired before cooling down is more of a benefit than a detraction. Anyway, they laid the specs out around 1957, 1958, and, well, the design bureaus in the USSR were told to get to work. Several people, design teams would submit proposals. A young, at the time, Dragunov would. Detyev would actually update his DP. Used to be called DP28 when I was young. Now everyone calls it the DP27, really just the DP. He would update it to be a more modern magazine-fed gun. Kind of looked like a Bren, kind of a top-feed thing. And, of course, Mikhail Kalashnikov. And Kalashnikov, much like Detyev, didn't want to reinvent the wheel. He just updated and altered what was at the time his newest design, the AKM, with his team at Izhevsk to meet the needs. And there were a couple of others, but those seemed to be the kind of the three big ones that submitted designs in 58, 59. A lot of sources say that the RPK was adopted in 1959. I don't think so. I think that was the year the design was finalized and maybe pre-production or prototypes were produced. But it actually seems like adoption was a little bit later. That's because between 1958 and 1960, or even 61 early on, the Soviet States Armament Committee hosted, conducted, overviewed multiple layers of trials, testings, evaluations of all these guns. They would do the same kind of environmental test across the USSR: heat, cold, sand, dust, ice, mud, wherever. They would do endurance testing with automatic fire. We talked about quite a bit of the details in the AKM video, just more so because it's a presumably light machine gun. And the results, well, the Dragunov design was more accurate, not surprising, and it was a little more modern, compact, lightweight, but it actually was probably the least reliable or least durable. The Dictator design, I think it was just too dated and too complicated to produce. He still kind of was relying on an updated version of his flapper locking system. Obviously, Kalashnikov, it was where it was at. His design kind of hit all the things. The testing revealed that his design was the most reliable, dependable, easiest to field strip, clean, maintain, fix on the unit armor level. Also, it was the easiest to train conscripts on. Part of it is because the gun was simple. Part of it is because, well, they're using it. By this time, they're switching over to the AKM, so very similar manual of everything. As far as its firing performance, it was rated as adequate. Its full auto accuracy, overheating, all that was not the best, but it met minimum criteria. And at the end of the day, that's kind of what all matters. So, in 1961, the Soviet Ministry of Defense officially formally adopts Kalashnikov's design as the RPK 7.62. Often translated as Kalashnikov light machine gun, I think in spirit that's correct. The truth is it more directly translates to Kalashnikov's handheld machine gun. A very minor distinction in English, but there you go. Now, I said this was designed in early versions, made it ish-esque. But of course today, including this rifle here, we identify it with what we know as Molot. That's because a decision was taken, 61, to transfer production to Molot of the light machine gun. Most likely, whoever had been the winner, they would have been built there because they want to spread out manufacturing for obvious logistical military reasons, but also to allow each factory to kind of focus and specialize in. And since World War II, Molot had been doing kind of heavy machine gun types and light autocannon types, and they were better suited, leaving Ishesque to really focus on the AKM. Tula would obviously focus on the AKM too, but their position was a little unique. Ishesque primarily focused on Soviet manufacture for themselves and very close allies. Tula, while they would obviously make a lot of AKMs, they would actually focus on setting up domestic production, with the most well-known example being over in Egypt for the Mahdi line. So that's why Molot was kind of given the RPK thing, and as evidenced by this one, with the date of 61, they obviously were at least in some level of production by that year. So what do we have here? Well, you know what it is, but it's hot outside, so yeah. We have a heavy version of an AKM barrel. It is pressed and pinned into the receiver, not screwed. It's 23¼ inches long, so actually a little bit longer than the RPD. It is threaded 14x1 left hand, although just had a muzzle nut. Pretty standard AKM front sight base, just larger. We do have a secondary ring here to further support the long cleaning rod. We have this bipod. It is squared off, stamped in welded steel. A little more efficient to produce than the tubular version on the RPD, also a little lighter. I like how the cleaning rod also kind of doubles as bipod retainer. It's a cool little feature. We have a pretty standard upper handguard, but the lower is thicker and heavier to both work with the barrel and to help with heat dispersion. From the get-go, this had a unique rear sight that is elevation and windage adjustable, because these were expected to have a little longer range in use. But of course, probably most famously, they were built on a 1.5mm stamped receiver, whereas the AKM was 1.0. Forged front trunnion, forged rear trunnion. The front is bulged. The rear is made stronger as well. And early on, they had wood pistol grips, wood buttstock, and this is a clubfoot design, inspired by the RPD, but not interchangeable. And of course, this is a Kalashnikov system. We'll crack it open here in a minute. But let's talk about the feeding devices, the magazines, because as I said, belts were not allowed. Most famously, we have a drum. Comes in a pouch, and what's neat, you can simply take the top off the pouch and lock it in your gun, or if you need to remove the pouch, it's buttoned in here. This is a top-loading drum with this lever. I've said in many videos, I absolutely prefer the top-loading style over the Chinese kind of back-loading style. Much like the AKM and the RPK itself, it has a paint over phosphate finish. And these are Mulot marked. The idea was the machine gunner in the squad will be given one of these drums, but they're really too cumbersome and slow to reload in the field under fire. So he was also given a pouch of 4 of these to use for reloading. I think these are actually Romanian made, but these pouches are too big and heavy to bring more than a few out. And they are just extended versions of a standard AKM mag. And so that was the typical loadout that the one single machine gunner could carry, keeping on with the one-man portable thing. 1 drum and 4 extended magazines. Later on, the drum would actually get swapped out for a second pouch of mags, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about Soviet Doctrine, how it's evolving by the 1960s, and crack this one open just for a second. Legion again with the standard mag. Wide smooth. Note how it rests fine on its bipod with the drum in. This began back in the 50s, but by the 1960s, the Soviet Red Army, and for that matter, the airborne, the VDB, they're really heading the way in modern warfare, using what we think of as APCs, more like fighting vehicles. The BMP became very famous, and the BMD was an airdropped, more compact version for the VDB, VDV. It's ahead of its time. They were also NBC protected, nuclear, biological, chemical. The idea was, instead of just the infantry marching across the field, they'll get where they need to go in vehicles, dismount into 2 teams, typically a fire team and a maneuver team, support team, leaving a few crew on. And that kind of gets us to why this needed to be just like a single-man deal. And by this point, if you look at the kind of weapons assigned to a Red Army squadron, it's mostly AKMs, with 1, maybe at most 2 RPKs, and then maybe an RPG guy in there, and they would float SVD Dragunov guys in and out. Years ago, I did a video looking at the exact breakdown of the weapons used, but I probably should do an updated version. But it goes to show you kind of the idea. As I said, in a more defensive or fixed role, you would kind of grip it here and here and use this. But in a more marching role, you would fold up the bipod and grip it like a normal rifle. So it could be used both as more of a machine gun and a rifle. It's about 10.5 pounds unloaded. That might sound like a lot to us today, but that was 5.5 pounds lighter than the RPD. Not to mention, its ammunition carriers were lighter and easier to use. I mean, it's a little hard to reload an RPK drum in the field. Try reloading an RPD belt drum. Yeah, so they had to even carry more. At least there's potential. And, you know, worst case with this, you can grab a standard mag from your buddy with the AKM next to you. By the way, the sling with the shoulder pad, it's original. These are slightly longer than a standard. Got the pad, just for kind of marching use. But that, let's crack her open here. Here's the sling, pretty well extended out, just to show you. It is longer than your average Kalashnikov type. Which, yeah, lots of purposes for that, I would say. Pretty standard insides, just the heavier receiver. You might be wondering about this top cover. It's ribbed. That's actually correct for this make. One carryover feature that lasted from the original AK is this recoil system. Rather than going to the thinner wire type of the AKM, the RPK retained the slightly stiffer, stouter, heavier machine tube type of the original AK. This is done for durability, most obviously. It also had a little bit to do with slowing the rate of fire, because we do have a fixed barrel. By the way, it is chrome lined, cold hammer forge. They were able to keep the cyclic rate down to about 600, so it wouldn't overheat. And of course, Doctrine was to just fire burst and let it cool off. They also extended the receiver just a tad, so the bolt group took just a little bit longer to cycle. All these things slowed the rate of fire by about 50. And it has pretty much a conventional Kalashnikov bolt group. Yes, it is dirty. I was shooting it. I still plan on putting a few more mags through it as I do this video, so I haven't cleaned it yet. Notice that the carrier does not have a lightning cut. But otherwise, it does use the same length of gas piston, same type of gas tube, same kind of fire control group. Of course, the military guns would have three-way. And even though some of the big parts, you know, the barrel, the handguard, all that, are absolutely not interchangeable with an AKM, all the little parts, the ones that you probably would break, actually are, meaning that there is a 60-65% parts interoperability at the armor level between AKM and RPK. While that was not required by the trials, it was sure a nice bonus. The idea was to issue at least one of these per infantry squadron, so mass production was absolutely a necessary thing. The very first one started to appear in the field by 1963, and by 64, 65, they are getting very widespread. While they were never intended to replace the PK, the PKM, they absolutely were intended to replace the RPD, and even a few old DPMs that were still knocking about. And, well, they did. Once Molot got up and running, because they were able to focus on this, they were able to crank these out thousands at a time. And the Soviet public first officially were introduced to this in 1966 at the May Day parade, where the Soviets really liked introducing a lot of these things. And they would keep cranking them out for another decade plus at Molot. And there would be some production updates, although not as many as you might think, and a few variations, the most notable being the RPK-S, the side-folding version. Honestly, it looks identical to this, even the same style of stock. It just has a hinge back here. One interesting thing about it, while unfolding it, there's a button inside. To fold it back, you actually had to use a bullet tip and a recess in the receiver to fold it on the the RPKS. I had one years ago, did videos on it, but during COVID, can't keep everything in this old world. It too was a Legion build, by the way. But one of them had to go, and I thought this early one was just too cool to let go of, personally. And they are a lot of fun. Always been something for me about these guns. Frankly, that's about it. The gun had very few changes. It worked well. Not many nations would make these outside of the Soviet Union, but many would buy them from the USSR because they didn't need that many for their own troops. There would be a few unique kind of takes on it. For example, East Germany would buy some, and they would be one of the few nations to not just stick with the muzzle nut. They would actually put the AKM-style slant brake on. They were Russian-made guns. Presumably the slant brakes are probably the German-made, but I don't know. And Molot would cease production in the mid to late 70s, but that's only because they were switching over to the 545 RPK 74, which was very much like this. Whereas there's a pretty noticeable difference between the AKM and AK-74. Between the RPK and the RPK-74, there's only one or two noteworthy changes, and everything else is pretty minor. And the truth is, in the form of the RPK-74M and the RPK-200 series, this same basic gun is still made today. I mean, you get a current production gun like the Molot VEPRs that were imported. There are many more similarities with this than differences. Yeah, and Peanut agrees. And that's a sign of a good design. It's not perfect, but considering what they needed it to do, the constraints, and just how many they needed to build, it worked. And speaking of, we do not know how many RPKs, RPKSs that Molot turned out for the Red Army and export. Best estimates I've been able to see are roughly 250,000, with 50,000 of those being the S, the other 200,000 being the standard model. There was also an RPK-N that was a very uncommon variant that had a scope rail on the side, primarily used for night vision more than daytime magnified optics. But there you go. And they all kind of bleed together because, like I said, Molot's still making them today, so where's the cutoff point? That said, now let's talk about our second rifle. You would think the dong would make getting the standard mag in difficult, but it really doesn't on this Romanian RPK. Really about as smooth as a Legion. Whereas our first one was a build done very well, but still in the USA by Legion, the AS-10B is a true import from the future arsenal in Romania. Pretty much the best and kind of in some ways only authentic RPK to ever be imported. I've talked about it in previous videos. You know, the Valmet M78 is kind of its own thing. China never did an RPK. Yeah, no, the 87 is often called an RPK. It absolutely isn't. Most other places, like with Mahdi, they just did long barrel AKMs. But this had all the features. But it's in kind of their own unique guise as a paratrooper here. And it's fitting that it comes from Romania, because outside of the Soviet Union, really Romania was the other big RPK manufacturer. Just so I can go ahead and put it in the gun. Here is the Romanian-made drum. It's very similar to the Russian, although it has a blued finish. Some will have phosphating. Romania didn't really do the whole paint over phosphate thing. It's in a different style pouch by a little bit. It's actually a little bit better than what Russia had, because where your loading arm is, they added a leather pad. The Russian pouch doesn't have that, so it doesn't wear through as much. And of course, as we already saw, Romania would do the extended mags and everything else too. Yeah, the fixed stock version, initially known as the PM model of 1964. Basically, PM in this case stands for light rifle, light machine gun. PM64 was their designation. They got official prints and tooling from Russia, even initial parts from there. They were made at the Kuger Arsenal, like the PM63 and PM65, and the PSL for that matter, which we also have recently done a video on. These were put into production by 1965, and the earliest ones were very, very similar to the Russian guns, but as time would go on, they would kind of innovate themselves. For example, the paratrooper version here, with the originally kind of made in Germany and then copied by Romania and Poland, wire folding stock. The benefit to this style of stock, can't fold it when the drum's in, is you can easily take it off and put on a fixed wood stock. You're not dedicated to one or the other. Now let's try it like this, kind of in a, I don't know, door gunner configuration. Got a little more to it without that support. But I could see in certain situations that being preferable. The best name I've found for this is the PM64S, but take that for what you will. I've seen all kinds of names thrown about. It doesn't seem like they made a huge distinction. And I'm also not sure. This, of course, has the unique Romidon grip, but which models this grip did and did not appear on are also up for debate, and we can't really go with what's in America because a lot of the AES-10Bs built with original parts, even original handguards, for reasons they had this shaved off. If you look very closely at the base of your AES-10B, you might see where this was cut right here. And I don't know if this foregrip was on the fixed stocks too when it was there, or if it only really was installed with the folding stock. It would make sense if so, because you lose the secondary point of contact with the folder, so you need something else, especially when you're in more of a fixed position. You'll notice this has the smooth top cover. There are some other differences too. Bipod. And this has a birdcage flash router on there, which is both correct and not correct. Not to mention a carry handle. So let's talk about changes that Molot made to the design by comparing these two, and then talk about changes that Kuger themselves started introducing to the design in the 70s and running through the 90s. Design changes and differences. As I said, 1963 was kind of pre-production, low rate production. By 64, 65, they were cranking it up, and they were making a few changes to streamline things. For example, early on, they had wood pistol grips, very similar to the original AK, just a little bit thicker. But in Russia, they would very quickly go to a polymer grip, Bakelite. This Romanian's actually good for it because Romania uses the concave checkering that Molot used, but Molot's colors tended to be more in the kind of brownish purplish Q. They went to that for pretty obvious reasons. Another change around the same time was with the top cover. Notice this is smooth, this is ribbed. The earliest RPKs had ribbed top covers, essentially the same as an AKM. I don't know if this was always intended to be changed or not, but by the mid-60s in Russia, they went to the smooth, which is thicker gauge steel. They say it's about 50% thicker stamped steel, and it's also a little faster to make. Interestingly, Romanian guns, because they got the pattern in 1964, your first few years in Romanian production actually have the ribbed top cover as well. In fact, the earliest Romanian guns, because they were setting up production, instead of using the RPK windage rear sight, used the standard PM63, therefore AKM rear sight. I don't believe Russian guns ever came out of the factory, except for maybe some prototypes, without this sight, though. So those were a couple of early on changes. Next, the receiver. This is US receiver on this one. It is 1.5 millimeter. It does have the original bulge train. It is dimpled. That is correct for original Molot production. With the AES-10B, it's a non-dimpled receiver, although still 1.5, all that, bulge train. That's actually correct. Though some people debate when Molot made the switch. I've seen as early as 1966. Some sources claim as late as 1972. They went from dimples to no dimples. But they didn't just leave it alone there. The whole point of the dimples, it's often said for mag stabilization. That might be a little bit of the case, but it was really there to reinforce the stamping on the 1mm AKM receiver, because there's no rivets right here, and this area is, not really supported by anything because the bottom's cut out for your mag, so it was done on the AKM to keep this from bending. They quickly realized that's not really necessary for the RPK because it's 1.5. Also, like with this gun, what they would do is they would simply weld plates on the inside of the receiver, so it is extra thick here to keep it from bending because these are built to machine gun standards. It's just so much easier not to have to dimple the heavy-duty gauge receiver. So that was dropped sometime a little before or around 1970 in Russia. Now, your earliest Romanian guns still had the dimpled 1.5 receiver. They seem to have switched over between 73 and 75, which is why if you're going to get an AES-10B and you want it to look right, try to find one that's the 70s or later dated, because all of the AES-10Bs came in on the same slab side receiver, and it's fine if you have a 69 or 70 gun. It's just, if you have your choice, that's the reason I went with this one. Wood furniture from Molot would seem to have a little darker shellac or stain to it. It is the same kind of birch laminate as we see on the AKM. The shape, the cut of the buttstock might change a bit over time, but that's just manufacturing variances that do slip in. Romanian were also a laminate type, but they tended to be a lighter color, and some could have an oil finish versus a shellac. Others were. As I said, Russian guns were paint over phosphate. That exact type of black paint used did change over the years, going a little glossier and a little darker over time. Earlier ones were a little matter. Romanian guns had a phosphate finish and or a salt blue finish. Sometimes the guns would be all one or the other. Like a lot of the early productions were just salt blue. But then you'll actually see a mix of guns with blued parts and phosphated parts. The gas blocks really did not change much over the years. Barrels didn't really change much. Front sight bases really didn't change much. Some carriers would have the lightning cut, some wouldn't. The bipod, though, this would be kind of the next area where first Molot, then Kuger would kind of work on these. Don't worry, both are absolutely unloaded. I just had them taken apart. So we'll focus on that. So when the bipod is not extended, you can see how this wants to kind of monopod on the mag. And the para rear stock definitely doesn't help things. So let's extend it out and see if it's any better. The RPK bipod is stamped in welded steel. Around 1968, give or take, they would update their technology, maybe new machining, new manufacturing techniques. The welds get a little cleaner. They also do change the shape of the feet a bit to be less squared with a little more of a lip on them. The collar also changes just ever so slightly, but this is only really important if you're cloning. Most of it is just manufacturing. That said, in the 70s, not long before they go over to the RPK 74, you do see some of the extended collars that have more of a pivot built in that do make their way onto some late production RPK 762s. So that is one variation worth talking about. But they still kept the muzzle nut, although for the RPK 74, yes, they would go to the birdcage flash hider, and newer RPKMs in 76239 can have the flash hider or nut. I've seen them both ways. What about this bipod over here from Romania? Well, their first guns copied the Russian exactly, but then around 76, 77, they started working with an adjustable leg bipod. And so there's kind of a second generation that has the adjustments, but it's on a more or less standard Russian collar. And then late 70s, very early 80s, they introduced this extended Romy collar, and it has these two. That's actually to put a bullet in so you can detach it. This unbuckles. The collar will stay on your barrel, but this has a bolt that comes off to pull either for storage or transport or repair. Whereas your Russian RPK, this is fixed, guys. The only way to really take off your bipod is to pop off your front sight base. Yeah, I don't think that was the smartest idea. For what it's worth, the earliest Romanian RPKs were sometimes seen with a kind of clamshell clamp-on PKM type bipod too. Hard to say if they came that way. Some say yes, some say no. I tend to think maybe they did as they were setting up production. But either way, by the time of this gun in 1989, the adjustable leg bipod is kind of the norm, the standard, no matter which variant you get from Huger. Oh yeah, much better. Even with the para stock, you've got plenty of clearance. I'm kind of curious if I fold it. Yeah, even folded, it actually ends up on the pistol grip rather than the mag. That's pretty good. And of course you can set it to whatever height you want, but there's no notches. So it is a bit of a crude system, but better than on the original RPK. Yeah, that's going to happen at one point. Table is just a little narrow. We will just call this the PM64S for simplicity with the folding stock. The same type of stock we see on the PA86 and the PM90, although I do feel like the arm in this area right here where it interfaces is ever so slightly thicker. Since this is a heavier receiver, to go inside the block is just ever so slightly different, but yeah, we're really splitting hairs. What's nice is you can put a fixed stock on. As I mentioned, Russia did the RPKS in small numbers for the VDV. I keep saying that, for the VDV. And those were so they could use them in the BMDs, the vehicles. They're really cool little vehicles that I've done videos on in the past, but space was at a premium, and a 41-inch gun was a hard time getting in and out, so being able to fold the stock and take around 10 inches, 9 inches off really mattered. But you were stuck with it. It had its own dedicated rear trunnion. It added weight. This, you know, the stock and the handguard can be switched out easily. What about a few other things, though? Goes to show you, even with the bipod fully collapsed in, which is actually a little bit shorter than standard, it doesn't really monopod on the drum. It's kind of right there at it. Like Russia, Romania would eventually go to a 545 RPK, but they didn't have a license from Russia to do it, so it was really based on the original RPK they had. And for that gun, kind of to accompany the PA-86, they would introduce a carry handle and a birdcage flash hider. That's for the 545 gun, though. By the way, the 545 either had a folding stock, like this, very common, or a fixed stock with a flip-up shoulder rest butt plate, less common. What is even the name of the 545 gun? The best I've been able to come up with is PM93, but I've seen everything else before. Kind of like finding the name here. Late style. And here's the thing, too, about Romanian guns. There's Kuger factory names, and then there's military names. Either way, this came in with the carry handle, even though it's 7.62. A lot of your AES-10Bs did. Even your AES-10s did. Russian guns never had a carry handle. It's not a great design. It's very offset, and it's only really held on with a clip. But it is there. I just put on the birdcage because I thought it was neat. And this is a 7.62-39 Romanian made. This isn't one of the JMax. It came out of a Romanian parts kit. Just to kind of give it a look. I even thought about putting a Bakelite upper on, but I didn't want to break up the cool handguard set here. So that's a few late features I just thought they would carry over, including the unique Romy bipod. I like this bipod. It definitely keeps you from monopodding on the 40-round mag, but it can be a little, well, like I said, wiggly wobbly. You know we had to do it. Obviously, there's nowhere to grip the stock back here, but luckily we have up here. I will say, when it's collapsed in, you're shooting like this, the bipod does feel less wibbly wobbly, a little more sturdy. This does have a good trigger on it. And that is all she wrote. I've done complete deep dives on the AES-10B before. We're not going to do that today. You can check the channel and search to find those. This is mine. I really like it. This batch, they were all 1989 dated. They were all sold as paratroopers. Matching numbers came in once from Century. They seemed like they were a lot of money back then, but then they disappeared. I'm glad I have it. This isn't one I put together. It did come with the stock and everything. Back then, they also shipped them with a pouch of 4 mags and other fun accessories. The sling is standard Romanian, kind of late style canvas. I've gone on record as saying I really like it. The mag pouch, the mags I brought out this time are the Romanian steel. That's always what they stuck with. They did this too when they did their 545 version. I should mention there is also, of course, the so-called Bakelite, the AG4 mags. Just like with the AKM, these were introduced in an extended form for the RPK around 1968, 1969, and they would be from the Molot factory. There's at least 2 or 3 versions I've seen. Some have a lot number mode code on them, and then the Molot shield symbol. Some have the code, and then just like an empty circle with no shield in it, and some have the code, and then on the other side, they're just completely smooth. Some are obviously scrubbed, but I don't think all are. I think some that Molot produced just did not have the shield for reasons that I would only be speculating at. It's around this time, too, that they kind of move away from issuing one drum and one 4-slot pouch and to start issuing 2 4-slot pouches for the RPK. And when you get to the RPK 74, they don't even do a drum. They experiment with them. They try them out. The pancake drum is quite famous. But in the end, they just go with an extended 45 round, in this case, 5.45 mag for that gun that's not on the table. So by the 70s, drums are just not really in great use. I guess they've decided that the costs, the detractions outweigh the benefits, the pros, what have you. Can't disagree with them. But they're sure cool, though, on the table. I think we can agree. But what do you think? Okay, back inside. It is not cool out there. But these are cool and a lot of fun. And for a lot of years, undervalued and underappreciated. Again, you can criticize not having a quick change barrel. The thing is, if you have a quick change barrel, it doesn't do you any good unless you issue your soldiers with at least one spare barrel. That adds considerable weight and does kind of get away from that one-man machine gun team. You almost need 2 men if you're going to carry a spare barrel. And they didn't want to do that. Better to just let them cool off, and if in some situation you needed that, oh hell, just issue 2 RPKs. For what it's worth, Romania 2 would export to several nations, the PM64 and its variants, so it wasn't just exclusive to them. And as we can see by the date on this one, they were at least producing the 7.62-39 version up through 1989 and probably even a little bit later. Now, the AES-10B would probably be one of the last AKs types I would let go of. It's just so cool and authentic, and you do kind of get lucky, as we talked about, with the receiver not being dimpled, whereas it's a little bit of an eyesore on the Wasser 10. On the AES-10B, it actually is appropriate, and to me, having a dimple on a later production RPK is an eyesore in and of itself. I mean, that's one reason when I was getting guns from Legion, I looked for an earlier 60s date because they were using the NDS receivers. They were all dimpled, which is, again, fine for this era. But if I had them do a 70s dated trunnion gun, it wouldn't be the end of the world, but it would be correct, and I really wanted this to be as good as possible. If you're, only going to have one, and I'm really glad I did, because as it stands, Legion USA hasn't been the same for many years, but back in the day, they could sure slap together a very attractive, very smooth AK, RPK, and they imported a lot of cool parts besides. If you can't tell, I kind of miss those guys, but all good things come to an end, guys, including this video. At least I hope it was good. And one more with the Russian, why not? It definitely goes quick, but is reliable. I appreciate you tuning in today, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear about your own RPK. Have you done a build? If so, did you use a Romanian or did you find a Russian kit? Maybe you have a Pulemyot VEPR. Really, all the VEPRs we got, their DNA goes back to the RPK one way or the other. Although, unfortunately, the only authentic mil-spec ones came in right at the ban period back in 2017, and they were, of course, the modern RPK 74M and RPKM configuration, which, again, as I said at the top of the video, if you want a video on the 5.45 guns, I probably have enough ammo left to do that as well. We can talk about different mags and variations, but even today, the guns are uniquely Pulemyot and very similar. Even the folding mechanisms on the current guns are pretty much the RPK-S folding mechanisms just ever so slightly updated, so you don't need a bullet tip to fold them. That's one reason I didn't keep the Legion RPKS. I just felt like it was too similar and too valuable, plus a kit build, so had to let it go. Same with my Romanian AES-10B fixed stalker. I can't keep everything, unfortunately. So I try to keep the ones I like the most, and both of these are very smooth, very fun. The Legion in particular, very nice trigger. The Cuger here, of course, is built with the original military parts, just has a new Romanian semi-receiver and a new Romanian cold hammer forged barrel. They did cut off the dongs, so you had to do something about that. Otherwise, they were good to go, bipod included. The Legion guns, because of a situation with Russia and the fact that they haven't made this style since the 70s, early 80s at the very latest, you know, you have to use a U.S. receiver because you're not going to find a virgin. I guess you could cut up a VEPR, but yeah, I wouldn't do that. And you, of course, have to have the right profile barrel. Should mention that, yes, there are the Bulgarian quote-unquote RPKs. Bulgaria started making them in 1971, but they're a hybrid. For one thing, the barrel's a little shorter, a little fatter, about 21 inches, and they are on a milled receiver. That's cool. I really like them. Did a video last year on one, but it's their own pattern, and that's really what you see when I say that really no one else made RPKs outside of Russia. That's what I mean. Other people made Kalashnikov-based support weapons, saws, LMGs, absolutely. They just weren't the actual Kalashnikov RPK pattern. They were something else. And I really wanted a Russia one for the collection. And the nice thing about Legion back in the day, most of their gunsmiths and workers there were former Izhevsk, Izhmash, or Molot employees, or at the very least had been trained by them, and you can really see it in their riveting. It's perfect, frankly. Absolutely quality. And they used the best barrels and receivers they could get in the USA. With their AKMs, they did the Childers receiver and the FB Raiden barrel. So imports. With this, they had to go with the U.S. Green Mountain barrel because they made an authentic RPK type. And the Nodak is as good as you can get. Again, dimples notwithstanding on certain builds. And these are usually all matching parts kits because they came over demilled from Molot, really clean, really nice, what have you. And it was Legion that also had the drums and mags, including the Bakelites, and back in the day, they sold them for very reasonable money. In fact, these guns were reasonable money back in the day. Don't mean to kind of be that guy, but I'm really glad I got into AKs when I did, kind of ahead of the curve and then during the curve, because I want to be honest, if I were younger today getting into guns, I don't know if I would specialize in AKs like I do. I'd probably pick something else, frankly. I'd get a couple of AKs as representatives in the collection, and then, I don't know, ARs, MP5s, those are kind of what are the good deals and happening right now, in my opinion. But I know you guys like Kalashnikov-inspired videos, and I like making them, so here's your one for this cabin trip. I'll probably try to do that each time. It's just, with the 7.62-39 ammo situation right now, I'm being conservative about how much I shoot. I know it's not the end of the world. I don't think it's going away. It's just the ammo is a little harder to get than it used to be and a little more expensive than it used to be. And with that, I'm just having to be a little more careful. On top of the fact that I've been able to get a really good 5.56 and whatnot from Phoenix. I've just kind of been leaning towards that direction because I can get the ammo right now and it's a little cheaper than for these, even if I do enjoy these a lot. And they're very reliable. Hadn't had any troubles. Didn't have any troubles today when shooting. With that, I'd love to hear what you have to say in the comments. I like having a dialogue. If you could go over and support on Patreon, that would be awesome. Also always looking for good new video ideas over there too. If I can do them, I will. If not, I'll explain why. But if you can't do that because money is tight for you too, yeah, liking, sharing, subscribing. You can also do just a super thanks one time here on YouTube. Whatever you can do is appreciated. It's not what you do, it's just the thought of doing it that matters. And always check out our back catalog. I've pretty much covered all the AKs in time, so just use the YouTube search and type in whatever you're looking for. With that, I'm going to go in because I'm sweating. This is Misha. Peanut and I will catch you very soon next time.